My name is Kim Langmaid, and I'm an associate professor here at Colorado Mountain College Edwards campus. I teach in the bachelor's programs in sustainability science and our new bachelor's program in ecosystem science and stewardship, which is starting this fall. And one of our academic priorities is to educate students so that they can become responsible citizens and leaders in our community. And the topic this evening is especially one that is important for all of us here in Western Colorado, and excited to have all of our partners here this evening: Walking Mountain Science Center, the Climate Action Collaborative, Eagle River Water and Sanitation District, and Eagle River Watershed Council, where we have one of our interns working on a water efficiency plan. So thank you all for being here, and thanks to Don and Jennifer Holdsworth for sponsoring this program. Now I'll turn it over to Mark Ian.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to you, Kim, as well, the founder of Walking Mountain Science Center, and thank you to Colorado Mountain College for this wonderful location for us to host the Science Speaker Series. Thank you all for joining us for this second of our presentation of the Don and Jennifer Holdsworth Climate Speaker Series, where we continue to bring in leading experts from a variety of backgrounds to explore the ecological and societal impacts of climate change and the creative solutions needed to address humanity's most pressing problem. This is a hybrid style event with two audiences, one here at Colorado Mountain College and another joining us virtually. So hello to everyone joining us virtually. There will be time for Q&A following the main presentation. For those of you here in the room, please save your questions for that time. And if you are joining us virtually, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. What we'll do is we'll monitor and collect those questions. Walking Mountain's mission is to awaken a sense of wonder and inspire environmental stewardship and sustainability through natural science education. By joining us this evening, you are participating in our mission, in particular to increase climate change awareness, understanding, and help our community take bold actions, which are certainly needed. We also wish to thank and acknowledge our program partners. Thank you, Kim. Thanks for everyone that's here. And I also want to briefly highlight some of the local action being taken to address climate change here in Eagle County. So you see the slide behind me, as well as those of you that are joining virtually, you can see the slide. The Climate Action Collaborative, made up of Eagle County and our local towns and municipalities, nonprofits, businesses, and volunteers, with specific goals to reduce CO2 emissions, as the slide says, 50% by 2030. The sector groups listed above, energy supply, buildings, waste, and transportation, are made up of experts that work collaboratively to undertake initiatives to accomplish this goal. The entire collaborative is governed by a group of publicly elected officials and government employees, providing the funding and establishing policies to help our community reach these goals. So thanks to everyone that's involved in that Climate Action Collaborative initiative, and if you have more questions about it, please don't hesitate to ask any of Walking Mountain Science Center staff. And now I'd like you to know a little more about Don and Jennifer Holdsworth, the presenters of this new series. Don is a board member of Walking Mountain Science Center, and Jennifer is on the board of the Friends of Mountain Rescue. They are also active organizers of a Climate Conversations speaker series in North Carolina, and their philanthropic work is singularly focused on supporting environmental and educational organizations active in the fight to slow climate change and its impacts. So again, thank you so much for being here with us this evening, and thank you, Don and Jennifer. And now I'm going to pass things over to Don, who's going to introduce our speakers for the evening and will be one of the facilitators throughout. And if you ever need somebody to get a climate speaker series going, as Don, when Don volunteered with this effort, he literally did all the work in contacting the speakers. I said, this is amazing, Don. Like, no one's ever stepped up to do this before. And he says, well, I used to be a highly paid consultant, so I'm responsive to my clients. So thank you so much, Don. We appreciate your hard work, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
I appreciate that, Mark. And it is true that Jennifer and I are singularly focused on the issue of climate change and the threat to the human species and, quite frankly, our natural world. But I can't help to acknowledge that, you know, there's a threat to our citizens of the world going on right now. Very, very sad about what's happening to our friends in Ukraine. So I know it's on everyone's mind, and it pales in comparison to what we're talking about tonight. But war also has climate implications in terms of the degradation to natural areas of our world. So anyway, putting that aside, which is difficult to do, we really have two fantastic speakers tonight. Brian Mcpherson, who's with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and Lynn Brooks. You two want to come on up and have a seat? And Lynn Brooks with the Eagle River Water and Sanitation District. We're going to hear from Brian first, and then get brief remarks from Lynn, followed by plenty of time for Q&A. It's always the most fun part of any presentation. But I'd like to introduce both of the speakers now, if I may. First of all, Brian, who I mentioned, he works within the Interstate, Federal, and Water Information section of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Brian runs the Colorado Decision Support Systems program, where he collaborates with the Division of Water Resources to produce publicly available water data and modeling tools. He also serves as a technical advisor to the Colorado River Commissioner, Becky Mitchell, and is active within various Colorado River work groups and negotiation teams. He is also he focuses on the science of the Colorado River. He's also a bit of a history buff, and he loves interspersing stories, rumors, and characters from the river's past. I'm looking forward to the rumors. Brian originally hails from upstate New York and has degrees from Cornell University and the University of Colorado. And he's married to a West Sloper and has one little Colorado native of his own. So we're grateful that Brian is here to speak to us about perspectives from the Headwater state, hydrology, science, and policy of the Colorado River. So welcome, Brian. Next, I'd like to introduce Lynn. Lynn Brooks is the general manager of the Eagle River Water and Sanitation District. She oversees the provision of drinking water services and wastewater treatment for developed areas in the Upper Eagle River watershed from Vail to Cordillera. Educated in geology and water resources engineering, Lynn is responsible for overall operations, long-range planning, management of the district's broad portfolio of water rights, and the mitigation of impacts of human uses of the water resource that can affect stream flows and water quality. Lynn's remarks she will share in her remarks local management and operational challenges caused by climate change and drought. So welcome, Lynn. So Brian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Brian Mcpherson, and as Don said, I work in the Interstate, Federal, and Water Information section of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or the CWCB for short. I am also Colorado's technical advisor to Commissioner Becky Mitchell on Colorado River negotiations. I will be presenting tonight on the hydrology, science, and policy of the Colorado River as it stands in 2022. I love this topic, and I'm excited to get to present this to you all who live and breathe water issues along the Eagle River, one of the Colorado's major tributaries. I'll be honest, this presentation is a bit depressing, but it is important for stakeholders in the basin to understand realities, to be able to diagnose issues, and to see where opportunities lie. I will not be presenting a silver bullet to our river's problems, of which there probably is not one, but will try to present the scientific foundation that will be key to chipping away at solutions. Next slide, please. Okay. In this presentation, I'll be covering an overview of the Colorado River geography, the law of the river, including the 2007 Interim Guidelines that currently dictate operation of the river, the current millennium drought and climate change, consumptive uses on the river in the upper and lower basins, environmental concerns on the river, near-term projections of future conditions on the river and its reservoirs, and current actions being taken in the Upper Basin and Colorado to address the critical reservoir levels currently seen in Lakes Powell and Mead. The geography of the Colorado River Basin is divided into the upper and lower basins within the U.S. and also extends into Mexico, which receives an apportionment of water at Morelos Dam. The upper basin is comprised of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. The lower basin is comprised of California, Arizona, and Nevada. The dividing line is at Lee Ferry, Arizona, which is below Glen Canyon Dam at the top of the Grand Canyon. Lakes Mead and Powell, formed by Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, are the major reservoirs in the system and were constructed in 1933 and 1966, respectively. Along with Lake Powell, the Aspinall Unit, which is comprised of Blue Mesa Reservoir, Crystal Reservoir, and Morrow Point reservoirs on the Gunnison River, Flaming Gorge Reservoir, and Navajo Reservoir, provides storage for the upper basin to meet its compact obligation at Lee Ferry. More to come on this. Provides storage for the upper basin to meet, more to come on this. Lake Mead serves as storage and drought protection for the lower basin. The Colorado River Basin is further stretched by transbasin diversions, which are tunnels or canals that export water from the basin. These include 22 tunnels and canals to the Front Range of Colorado for municipalities and agriculture, and 7 to the San Luis Valley for irrigation. In other states, there are transbasin diversions to Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Albuquerque, etc., with a recent proposal for a new pipeline to St. George, Utah. This map shows the upper basin, lower basin, dividing line at Lee Ferry, and adjacent areas such as the Colorado Front Range that receive Colorado River water through exports. Some of the purple lines at the bottom show major canals, such as the All-American Canal, Colorado River Aqueduct, and Central Arizona Project Aqueduct that bring water to the Southern California cities, Imperial and Coachella Valleys of California for irrigation, and Central Arizona for municipal and irrigation use in Maricopa and Pinal counties. This slide is supposed to be a bit overwhelming. The amount of laws and acts on here. The river as it stands in 2022 is highly managed and far from its wild state that John Wesley Powell found it in 1869, known as the Grand River in Colorado at that time. As an aside, Colorado Congressman Edward Taylor, here's the rumors, in 1921, used some misleading statistics to prove that the Grand River in Colorado was larger than the Green River in Wyoming. It's not. To convince the House Committee on Interstate Commerce to extend the river's name into Colorado, upstream of Moab, Utah, on the smaller of the two tributaries, a no-no in USGS naming convention. Anyway, a large catalog of compacts, treaties, and acts of Congress comprise the law of the river. Attorneys spend their whole careers interpreting and in some cases adding to this catalog, as will be done in 2026. Starting in 1922, the Colorado River Compact divided the river into two, allocating 7.5 million acre-feet to both the upper and lower basin and guaranteeing the upper basin not deplete the river at Lee Ferry below 75 million acre-feet over a 10-year period. More to come on these competing clauses when there's less than 15 million acre-feet per year in the river. It also stated that any future obligation to Mexico would be supplied first by surplus water in the system, and if no surplus water existed, the obligation would be split by the upper and lower basins. After that, the 1928 Boulder Canyon Project Act authorized the Hoover Dam and the All-American Canal, the largest irrigation canal in the world, into California's Imperial Valley and split the apportionment in the lower basin to 4.4 million acre-feet to California, 2.8 million acre-feet to Arizona, and 300,000 acre-feet to Nevada. The 1945 Mexican Treaty allocated a further 1.5 million acre-feet to Mexico, with the highest priority on the river. The 1948 Upper Colorado River Basin Compact divided the upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, into percentages of the available flow, a wise move as they were starting to get a hint that there may not be 7.5 million acre-feet available. Colorado gets the largest apportionment at 51.75%. As our team was reviewing the minutes of the 1948 Compact Commission meetings, we noted that Colorado's Commissioner, Clifford Stone, also the head of the CWCB at the time, came into the meeting with this statement. The state of Colorado offers to accept as its share of the apportionment made to the Upper Basin by Article 3 of the Colorado River Compact, an amount equal to 56% thereof. Colorado does not intend to approach the making of the Upper Basin Compact on the basis of a horse trade. The proposal made is not presented for bargaining purposes. Well, somehow we came out of the meeting with 51.75%. Here's hoping for better negotiations in 2026. In the 1950s and 60s, Lake Powell, Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs are authorized. Arizona claims exclusive use of the Gila River, and the Central Arizona Project is authorized in exchange for Arizona's agreement to be the junior priority in the lower basin. 1992 saw the passage of the Grand Canyon Protection Act, and by 2007 and 2019, the Millennium Drought had a grip on the basin, and the river's current operations were set, including cutbacks, voluntary curtailment programs, and emergency reservoir releases if needed. Negotiations are currently underway for 2026 when the current guidelines expire. This slide shows the historical water supply and consumptive use in the basin. We see notable high points in the hydrology in the 1920s when the compact was signed, called the pluvial period, meaning a period with increased precipitation, and in the 1980s. We also see that around the year 2000, the consumptive use in the basin exceeded the supply. This phenomenon is sometimes called the structural deficit and is obviously unsustainable in the long run. The basin is currently relying on stored water from its reservoirs. Looking back further into the hydrologic record of the river, which is created with tree ring records, we see even more so how abnormally wet the 1910s and 20s were. I've put a line at 15 million acre-feet showing how rare it has been for that amount of water to be reliably available, and an arrow at 1922, the year the compact was negotiated, at the tippy top of the pluvial period. We also see big dips in the 1950s and 2000s that are on par with droughts in the 1100s and 1500s. However, as we will see in the next slide, there is particular worry about this current 2000s drought. This slide shows temperature in the Colorado River Basin from 1895 to 2019. The trend from 1970 to 2020 is a linear increase of about 1 degree Fahrenheit per 15 years, attributable to climate change and rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. The concern with rising temperatures is a phenomenon called aridification. With higher temperatures, soil dries out faster, snow melts sooner, and native and non-native crops have higher demands for growth. Case in point, in 2021, there was an 85% of average snowpack in the Upper Basin on April 1st. Not too terrible. This is last year. However, when all was said and done by September 30th, 2021, this past fall, the runoff only yielded 30% of average stream flow. How did this happen? It happened because the summer of 2020 was hot and yielded little monsoon. On the graphic on the left, we see the soil moisture conditions in the fall of 2020 were largely in the 0 to 50% average range, bone dry. In the spring of 2021, much of the snowpack was reabsorbed into dry soils instead of flowing into the Colorado River. On the right, we do see that 2021 had better monsoon, and we see more oranges and yellows, indicative of 70 to 90% of average, except in the San Juan and Dolores basins of Colorado that remain bone dry. Low soil moisture will remain an issue in the basin, while temperatures remain high in the basin. If we recall from earlier, the 1922 Colorado River Compact apportioned 7.5 million acre-feet to both the upper and lower basins. It also mandated that the upper basin not deplete the river at Lee Ferry below 75 million acre-feet over a rolling 10 years. As we have now seen, there is insufficient water to make both clauses work, especially when there is another 1.5 million acre-feet apportioned to Mexico. aridification, and climate change make it unlikely that the current drought will end as it has in the past. A whole presentation could be done on climate change in the basin, but I will try to summarize current projections on this one slide. The figure on the left shows global climate model projections of precipitation by the 2040 to 2070 period. The various boxes represent differing emission scenarios and seasons of the year. The trends are generally neutral in Colorado compared to 1970 to 2000 for precipitation, but show hints of less precipitation in the southwest portion of the basin and more precipitation in the northern parts of the basin. If you like skiing, you may want to pull up Redfin and start browsing around Jackson in the next few years. On the right, however, we see a dramatic signal from the GCM projections of warming temperatures. It generally doesn't matter where you are in the basin. We're looking at increases of 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit by 2040 to 2070 compared to 1970 to 2000. We've already seen 3 of these degrees Fahrenheit increase since 1970. All of this leads to amplification of existing drought and average years becoming drought, as we saw in 2021. This slide shows a schematic of consumptive use in the basin. If you remember, again, the 1922 compact apportioned 7.5 million acre-feet of beneficial use to both the upper and lower basins. Starting upstream on the right, we see that the upper basin states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico consume an average of 4.6 million acre-feet in our beautiful, lush mountain and valley landscapes. The purpose of the 1922 compact was to allow the upper basin states time to grow, as even in 1922, the lower basin states were developing far faster than the upper basin states. If strict prior appropriation had dictated development of the river, which is the concept of first in time, first in right, the lower basin would have laid claim to nearly the entire river in 1922. The upper basin is now in the position of defending our right to fully develop, even 100 years later, while also acknowledging that there is insufficient supply in the river to meet the promises made in 1922. Excess water from the upper basin flows into Lake Powell, and then 8.8 million acre-feet per year on average is released through the Grand Canyon, past Lee Ferry, down to Lake Mead. If you also recall from the 1922 compact, the upper basin is obligated to release 75 million acre-feet over 10 years. There is also an argument that in some years we are responsible for filling half of the Mexican obligation, bringing our required 10-year release up to 82.5 million acre-feet. That water is used in the lower basin's hot, dry, smoggy metropolises, if you notice my choice of clip art, evaporates in the lower basin's deserts, and is used to grow crops such as almonds. In all fairness, our winter fruits and vegetables largely come from the lower basin. An additional 2.2 million acre-feet enters the basin through its tributaries. A total of 10.2 million acre-feet is consumed in the lower basin, and 1.5 million acre-feet is delivered to Mexico at the Morelos Dam. You may be asking, why do we release more than 7.5 or 8.25 million acre-feet, and why does the lower basin consume more than 7.5 million acre-feet? The answer largely lies in Article 3E of the 1922 Compact, which states, "The states of the upper division shall not withhold water, and the states of the lower division shall not require the delivery of water, which cannot be reasonably applied to domestic and agricultural use." This manifests itself in many parts of the law of the river, but in our opinion means that in times of shortage, the lower basin is responsible for cutting back its uses, which it has only recently started to do. Next slide, please. Of upper basin consumptive uses, this pie chart shows how that water is used. 64% of the water in the upper basin is used for agriculture. Agriculture in basin, predominantly for grass, hay, and alfalfa. Some people say that our main crop in the upper basin is cows, who eat the hay and the alfalfa. 17% of the water leaves the basin through trans-mountain diversions and is used for predominantly municipal or agricultural uses. 3% in the basin is used for industrial use for things like snowmaking and cooling at the coal power plants in Moffett and Routt counties. Finally, 2% is used for municipal users such as the Eagle River Water and Sanitation District. There are environmental concerns in the basin that I don't have nearly enough time to do justice, but will briefly mention. The first that I will mention is hydroelectric power generation from Glen Canyon and Hoover dams. The less water there is above the turbines, the less power they generate until the reservoirs go below what's called power pool. The dams, as of August, had lost nearly a gigawatt of generation combined, and elevations have continued to drop. Lake Powell is currently at 30 feet of elevation, so is down to 70% of its capacity. At 3490, which we will see may be approached in the coming 2 years, power generation from the dam will stop. Release temperature out of Glen Canyon Dam into the Grand Canyon is an issue that impacts wildlife habitat. Lake Powell is stratified by temperature, with warm water at the top and cool water at the bottom. As the lake level drops, warmer water is released from the penstocks and bypass outlets. This has impacts on aquatic wildlife that, as a non-biologist, I really have no business talking about, but do understand comes with risks to the fish and bug populations in the Grand Canyon. There are 4 endangered fish species found in the Upper Colorado River Basin, including the humpback chub, bony-tail, Colorado pike minnow, and razorback sucker. The Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program performs actions to restore habitat, remove invasive species, and maintain flows in the system that aid in recovery of these fish. In order for any project or new water use to be approved, Endangered Species Act compliance must be obtained through the program. If you know a lot about this and are interested in working for the CWCB, we are currently hiring in this area. And that took me a really long time to animate. Okay. Finally, flows in the Grand Canyon have significant impact on sediment, ecology, and recreation. The Long-Term Experimental and Management Plan, LTEMP, dictates flow rates out of Glen Canyon Dam. The LTEMP meets the 1992 Grand Canyon Protection Act's requirements. Rafters of the Grand Canyon are aware of the HFE, or high flow experiment, which pulses in the range of 40,000 CFS to mimic historic high flow events. As a non-biologist, again, I can't completely explain the benefits of the ecosystem, but it is an attempt to mimic Mother Nature. I do know that it's also important for sediment deposition so that rafters have beaches to camp on. I'm now moving on to near-term future projections of conditions in the basin, meaning within the next 2 years or so. I'll start by repeating this slide of soil moisture in the fall of 2020 compared to the fall of 2021. This sets the stage for this current winter's snowpack as slightly below average soil moisture in most of the basin and extremely below average in the San Juan subbasin. This is a plot of this winter's snowpack as of February 16th. As you know, in the past day or two, there's been a little tick upward, but this is generally what it looks like. You all know this, but the season started slowly through mid-December, and then the fire hose of atmospheric moisture was pointed at the Upper Colorado for about 3 weeks through early January. High pressure has set in again, and we've flatlined through mid-February. The rainbow of lines that come off of the end of the black line represent possible future scenarios based on the past 15 years, with each line representing the snowpack received after February 16th. The rainbow shading shows the minimum through maximum historical snowpack seen in the historic record from 1991 to 1991 to 2020. This unfortunately doesn't tell us very much, as this season could end up well below average or well above average, as seen with the top and bottom blue and red lines. This plot shows Lake Powell unregulated inflow, which means the water that makes it to Lake Powell after the upper basin diverts water for consumptive uses. The blue bars show the historical record from 1964 to 2021. The horizontal black line shows the average inflow received from 1991 to 2000 at 9.6 million acre-feet. The red, green, and dark blue lines at the end represent the 10th percentile, 50th percentile, and 90th percentile of projections for 2022. The dry soil moisture is accounted for here. We see that even though our current snowpack is near average, the expected runoff is well below average, except for the highest of traces. Finally, in this slide, we see projections of elevations of Lake Powell, as well as historical elevations since 2021. Lake Powell elevation is the biggest dictator in the basin of operations, as releases to the lower basin are tied to it. Going forward into the future, the red line shows what's called the minimum probable forecast, which represents the 10th percentile of projections. The green line shows what's called the most probable forecast, which represents the 50th percentile of projections. And the blue line shows what's called the maximum probable forecast, which represents the 90th percentile of projections. There is an additional 10% above and below the red and blue lines, which could represent either worse or better conditions than what is shown here. Again, as you can see, the large range from where we are today, depending on the precipitation for the remainder of the year and next year's snowpack. The reservoir currently sits in what's called the mid-elevation release tier, which is elevation between 3525 and 3575, but is likely to drop into the lower elevation balancing tier for 2023, which is any elevation below 3525. The dashed line at 3490 represents the bottom of the power pool when Glen Canyon Dam will no longer be able to produce hydropower. By 2023, we may be very close to that level. You back me up one? Thank you. This slide is a diagram from the 2007 Interim Guidelines and shows how releases from Lake Powell are tied to its and Lake Mead's elevations. There's a lot going on here, but in general, the higher Lake Powell is, the higher the releases. In the current mid-elevation release tier, and with Lake Mead above elevation 1025, Lake Powell is releasing 7.48 million acre-feet this year. In the lower elevation balancing tier, where we may be headed next year, Lake Powell may release 7 million acre-feet, but the word balancing indicates that if Lake Mead volume is less than Lake Powell's, more can be released to balance the reservoirs up to 9.5 million acre-feet. This range causes a lot of uncertainty in the system, and the somewhat arbitrary threshold at 3525, which we have been on the razor's edge of in recent years, means that big changes in releases can be caused by relatively minor actions and minor tweaks in forecasts or accounting. Many people in the basin have realized how fraught these bright lines are between tiers, and the next guidelines will likely have smoother transitions between operations. Based on the current state of the system, the near-term projections, and the law of the river, there are some current actions occurring on the river that offer some band-aids, but are insufficient to solve the river's issues if drought is the new normal. The 2019 Drought Contingency Plans, or DCPs, are a toolbox of short-term fixes. I will talk more about the upper basin actions of DROA and demand management in the next slides. In the lower basin, 2022 will be the first year ever of mandatory shortages. Due to the elevation of Lake Mead, the basin is currently in Tier 1 shortage, which requires some cuts primarily from Arizona. You can see in the plot the vertical black line indicating today's date and the elevation of Lake Mead being below 1075, the threshold for Tier 1 shortage. 2023 and beyond may fall into Tier 2 and Tier 3 shortages, shown by the range of red, green, and blue lines, again indicating the minimum, most, and max probable forecasts. These higher tier shortages would require continued cuts by all lower basin states and Mexico. The lower basin has recently also signed what it calls the 500+ plan, which endeavors to conserve 500,000 acre-feet in Lake Mead through voluntary curtailment and changes in accounting of stored water. The details are fuzzy, but it looks like much of the conservation will be compensated from the federal government through the recently passed infrastructure bill. The other major action in the basin is the renegotiation of guidelines, which will become operational in 2026. DROA, or the Drought Response Operations Agreement, calls for reservoir releases from Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs to prop up elevations of Lake Powell. It also allows for reoperation of LTEMP monthly releases from Glen Canyon Dam to avoid going below the critical elevation of 3525. These changes in monthly release patterns from Lake Powell, which will mean lower releases in the coming spring months and higher releases later in the summer and fall, do not change the required 7.48 million acre-foot release this year, but shore up the elevations for a few months. For releases from the upper reservoirs, as occurred in 2021 on an emergency basis, there is assurance that they will be recovered back to their original elevations at some point in the future. The releases from Blue Mesa Reservoir in Gunnison in 2021 had a negative impact on recreation and the local economy, as boat ramps ended up high and dry. The states and reclamation are balancing impacts to the upper reservoirs in exchange for water in Lake Powell. The demand management investigation authorizes 500,000 acre-feet of space in Lake Powell to be available to the upper basin for conserved consumptive use water if the states make a finding through their investigation that the program is viable. Conservation by upper basin water users would be voluntary, temporary, and compensated. There must be agreement amongst the 4 upper basin states and UCRC, which is the Upper Colorado River Commission, before a program can be authorized. In the past 2 years, work groups were formed with stakeholders from across the state to provide their input on different areas of the program. This is an area with potential for local impact in the Eagle River Basin, as water users in the basin could choose to participate in the program if the program is established. This would potentially mean fallowing of farmland, conservation projects at water districts, or less water diverted through trans-mountain diversions. To reiterate, water users would have to choose to participate in such a program and be compensated for their water. Furthermore, this program does not yet exist and may never get off the ground. Conserved consumptive use water would be sent downstream to the state line, so there is the possibility for enhanced flows and environmental benefits resulting from the program. Next slide, please. One final topic that I wanted to touch on is the issue of tribal water rights. I again cannot do this topic the justice it deserves, but I will talk a bit about Colorado's 2 Colorado River Basin tribes and how their water rights are tied to the larger Colorado River Basin story. The Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute reservations are located in the southwest corner of the state in the San Juan River Basin. In 1908, the Supreme Court issued the Winters v. United States opinion, which recognizes that when a reservation is created, it also reserves the water necessary to fulfill the purpose of that reservation. Arizona v. California in 1963 further established that practicably irrigable acreage was the standard to quantify the amount of water, meaning the amount of water required to irrigate all possible land on the reservation, and that the date associated with the water right, remember that the West abides by the prior appropriation doctrine, would be time immemorial or aboriginal, meaning first in line. However, putting these theories into practice has proven to be difficult, to say the least, and most tribal water rights settlements have languished for decades or are still pending in court. Colorado's tribes' water rights, however, were settled in 1988, a great year to be born, and amended in 2000. The main outcome of the settlement was the Animas La Plata project, which is comprised of Lake Nighthorse in Durango and an associated pump station. Tribes in the basin are integral stakeholders, and Colorado has close working relationships with its tribes coming into the 2026 renegotiations, which is something that unfortunately cannot be said for most other states in the basin. Next slide, please. I hope that in this talk I have provided a lot of information to chew on. While much of it can seem depressing and hopeless, there is a bright spot in the collaboration going on between stakeholders in Colorado, from the representatives at the state, to the large conservation districts and municipalities, to the on-the-ground water users, to the tribes in the southwest corner of our state, and many more. While there's a lot of work ahead of us, I believe bright minds on both sides of the continental divide are ready to defend our state's interests while also being part of the solution on the whole river. So thank you, and Lynn is up next.
Good evening. Good evening. So I'd like to start by making a plug to Brian and the decision support system, the work that your decision support system is doing. We use the studies and the data as the basis of the model that we've put together to model our water supply system and in forecasting the impacts of climate change on local precipitation and stream flows. Quick overview. Let's see if I can. Nope. Which button? Can you advance the slide for me, please? Thank you. So, quick overview of our local water service area for those of you who may not be familiar. The yellow boundary is Eagle County, and the blue boundary is the watershed that supports our local streams. The red shaded area is the combined service area of the Eagle River Water and Sanitation District, which provides water to the Vale area, and the Upper Eagle Regional Water Authority, which provides water to the Down Valley areas from Eagle Vale to Cordillera. We take our water supply primarily from Gore Creek and the Eagle River. So you're about to hear a lot more about dry soils. From a water provider's perspective, I don't think I'm alone in feeling that climate change has sneaked up on us. And that's not to say that we didn't know climate change was coming. We've been following the climate science since the early 2000s. And like all water providers, we focus on the efficient use of the resource, and we take actions to drive water conservation, as you'll see in a minute. But what has taken us by surprise recently is that, and that has had an unexpected impact on our water supply, is this issue of rapidly drying soils, caused by increased air temperatures and the commensurate increasing thirstiness of the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Our water comes from our annual snowpack. When it melts, it first fills any deficit in the soil moisture, and the remaining water becomes the stream flow that we live on for the rest of the year. Next slide, please. There's a lot of hydrologic variability, but theoretically, if you have average soil moisture and an average snowpack, you will end up with average stream flows. However, when the soil is dry, the melting snowpack first fills that soil moisture deficit, and then less of that snowpack translates into stream flows. Next slide, please. When this happens, we say that the runoff efficiency is low. A real-life example of this reduction in runoff efficiency can be seen for the watershed above Lake Powell last year, when an 86% average snowpack translated into a 36% of average inflow into Lake Powell. This illustrates just how much of that snowpack goes into filling the deficit in the soils when the soils start out dry. Decreasing runoff efficiency is also being experienced locally and significantly reduces our water supply. Next slide, please. This accelerated drying effect on soils was discussed in an article which many of you may have seen was covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR, and a number of other media outlets just in the last couple of weeks. The title of the article published in Nature was Rapid Intensification of the Emerging Southwestern North American Megadrought in 2020 to 2021. For 20 years, we've been in the most severe drought in 500 years. This study points to its further intensification just in the past 2 years. With the data from these 2 additional drought years, we are now in the worst drought in 1,200 years. So you can see how fast we are needing to adapt our perceptions of climate change and our corresponding planning. I won't go into a lengthy explanation of this graphic, but just know that from a water perspective, brown is bad and indicates severely dry soils. You can see 2002, and then you can see the 2 recent years of intensification. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to share with you a few graphs of how we use water now and how that's changed over the past 20 years, showing that we have already begun to adapt to a changing climate. Let me define one term before we jump into this. To understand water use efficiency by our customers, we look at water use per single family equivalent, or SFE for short, which represents the average daily water use of a typical single-family home. You can see that water use per single-family equivalent has fallen in our service area over the last 20 years, which means that our customers in general are getting more efficient in their water use. Next slide, please. We also look at the total water use in our system, and you can see that the total use by all of our customers has also dropped. Over this 20-year period, the number of SFEs in our service area grew by 25%, while our total water use decreased by 6%. We are serving more people with less water. The reason for the drop in total use and the improvement in water use efficiency is probably multifaceted. We largely believe, however, that it is due to our tiered rate structure. Next slide, please. Tiered rates are a way of charging more money per 1,000 gallons purchased the more you use. This graph shows how we have used tiered rates and evolved our rate structure over time to drive water conservation. And I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is dollars per 1,000 gallons, going from 0 there to $35 per 1,000 gallons. And this indicates our 5 tiers of our billing system. Tiered rate billing for water use began in 2003, when the tiers were first implemented after the drought of 2002. You can see our rate structure started with 3 tiers, but moved to 5 tiers in 2013. Every year, we have ratcheted up the costs of the higher tiers. This year, there's another big bump in the rates for the highest users, and our highest tier is now at about $33 per 1,000 gallons. I also want to point out that our philosophy for setting these tiered prices is to keep rates reasonable for customers who are using water reasonably and efficiently. And you can see that right there as compared to the other tiers. We're also aligning our tiered system so that the water that customers use indoors, that's inside the buildings of homes and businesses, is paid for at Tier 1 pricing. Water that customers use for reasonable irrigation of their landscaping is billed at Tier 2 rates. Then you can see that we charge much more per 1,000 gallons for water used above these reasonable and efficient levels. Water use in Tiers 3, 4, and 5 is considered wasteful and unsustainable, and the pricing signal clearly communicates that to customers and disincentivizes that wasteful use. Tiered rates are effective in reducing water waste, and that resulting water conservation means that we have not had to make significant investments in our water supply in 20 years. That's good news for customers. However, the results of our water supply modeling and climate impact forecasting show us that this approach will not be enough going forward. Our water supply is diminishing due to climate change. Since water supply is decreasing, our water use as a community will need to decrease also. Next slide, please. Since the majority of indoor use comes back to the stream, where it can be used again, indoor water use is a very efficient use of water, and arguably is the highest value use, since it would be the most difficult to live without. Because most of it can be recycled, this water use also has only a minimal impact on the water resource. Outdoor water use, on the other hand, is a very inefficient use because most of it doesn't make it back to the stream. It also has a relatively low value because we could live without it, or at least with much less of it. So it is also not a high value use. Outdoor water use does have a significant impact on the water resource. Outdoor water use, and by this I mean primarily the use of water for irrigating landscapes, is the obvious place to focus for further conservation. Next slide, please. So as we go to work trying to get customers to continue to reduce their overall use of water, we will be focusing almost exclusively on outdoor irrigation. Even with the reduction in use you've seen in these graphs, many subdivisions in our valley are using more water than they were entitled to when they were approved by Eagle County or by the towns. In some cases, there were square foot limitations on the amount of area homeowners could irrigate, and these are being exceeded. In other cases, homeowners and subdivisions are using more water than allowed by the water rights decrees for their subdivisions. This overuse cuts into the water supply reserves that help us weather prolonged drought periods and puts all of our customers at risk. In the next few years, we'll be working with these subdivisions to get their water use back into line with what was originally approved. Where these types of restrictions don't exist, we will create water budgets based on irrigable area on the lot and discourage the use of turf grass, which is by far the most water-intensive species used in landscaping. This is a really big effort. It will take time, and it will require the buy-in and cooperation of our customers. Next slide, please. You may also have read in the Vail Daily this week that we have just acquired a reservoir site near Intern, where once it's constructed, we will be able to store water from the spring runoff to provide greater resiliency against stream flows in the late summer and winter. Bolts Lake will protect our community from the impacts of climate change and will provide a supply of water to meet important community goals, such as workforce housing. We hope to have this reservoir online within 10 years. So in conclusion, these conservation and water supply efforts are vital to making sure that we live within our means and adapt to the realities of our changing climate and water supply. That's all I have. Thank you. I will turn this over to Dawn to run the questions.
Brian and Lynn, thank you so much. Mark, can you remind me how much time we have for Q&A to the bottom of the hour? Or Scott, sorry. It's guy in charge? Yeah. Okay. Well, we have a number of questions coming in online, but let's we're going to address the audience and then online and et cetera. It's the gentleman here. And I asked the speakers, keep your responses brief and we can get through more questions then.
How many total water users are in Tier 4 and Tier 5 right now?
Diane, you might have to help me with this. I think we have about 1,500 accounts. Yeah, about 10% of our water users are in those, get into those higher tiers at least once a year.
All right, then going online here, I see your hand up. I'll get you next. I think this is probably for Brian. Please address use it or lose it law. That might take an hour.
So use it or lose it. The word abandonment is tied to that. It is part of Colorado water law or water law in the West that you have to put your water to beneficial use in order to maintain a water right. In Colorado, it's very hard to abandon your water right. The Division of Water Resources makes every effort to reach out to the owner, to the landowner, to the water user. You basically have to try to lose your water right. There's a lot of misconception that if water users don't use their full amount of water, they'll lose it, which is really not true. So it's an important part of Colorado water law to make sure that we keep our books clean with our lists of water rights. We don't have bogus water rights that have lived in the system for many years, but there's also a lot of fear amongst water users that is not warranted, that they'll lose the water right if they don't use the full amount.
Question up here.
Lynn, thanks for talking about like homeowners and homesteads for water. Can you touch upon the ski industry and golf industry, the places that have the money to pay the higher costs, and what type of restrictions will come, even if they can keep paying for this? Like, when can we stop them from more usage?
Sure. So the ski areas and golf courses in general own their own water rights, so they are not supplied water by our system. So we can't really charge them for those uses. I think an important way to look at the use of water in our system and kind of what it costs us and what it costs the environment is around that value of use, and I kind of touched on that with the indoor and outdoor use. Indoor use is obviously very high value, outdoor less so. Uses that provide good economic drivers, generally we think those are higher value uses. You know, lawns on residential areas aren't really economic drivers, so that kind of puts that at a lower level. So I think it's a complex question. You also have to look at where they're using that water and when it's coming back to the stream. So for instance, snowmaking, snowmaking is taking the water out of the river often in the fall to fill a reservoir, or in the winter when stream flows are relatively low. A lot of that water does come back to the stream, but it comes back during the runoff period. So there are some pluses and minuses to that retiming of the water. Golf courses are actually very efficient users of water. They actually say that they don't like to put a lot of water on their golf courses because then they have to mow more and they have to use more chemicals and those kinds of things. That water use, generally golf courses sit next to the river, and a lot of the water that they do put on the golf course can kind of get through the groundwater back to the stream, as opposed to, say, where I live in Wildridge. I'm pretty sure not one drop I've ever put on my lawn has ever gotten back to the stream. So it's a very complex system, and I think every water use has some pluses and minuses.
Okay, back to an online question, and we'll get to the audience. I think this is probably you, Brian. How do trans-mountain diverters factor into these calculations? Are there diversions absolute, or are they part of the negotiations to address the reality of current available water?
So trans-mountain diversions, Denver Water, Northern Water, the home stake partners here in the Eagle Valley have absolute water rights, and they are treated just as any other water user in the Colorado River Basin would be treated in terms of their water rights. They are often more junior priority than the more senior agricultural water rights, which usually date back to the late 1800s. The trans-basin diversions were typically constructed in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So they are more junior, but they are perfectly valid absolute water rights. And you know, they certainly play into thoughts of the future, as any water right in Colorado does. They're subject to the compact, as all water users are. And if there were to be a demand management program, they would be participants in that program just as any other water user. So I guess the long and the short of it is they're treated essentially the same as any other water user in the Colorado River Basin.
Any audience here? Yes, ma'am. Right here. Sorry. No, we'll get you next. Sorry.
Hi. This valley from Vail through I Live in Eagle is full of HOAs and property management firms that are not typically staffed by experts who understand water rights and water best practices. So is there any trainings or best practices or resources out there that we can start pointing our HOAs and our property management firms to better utilize water in our neighborhoods?
One thing that we do is we do some training for local landscapers, and we have some really amazing landscapers here in this valley. I think they really understand not only how to create different kinds of landscapes. You know, if you want solid bluegrass, they can provide that for you. If you want something that's much more water or much less water intensive, they can certainly provide that too, and you can have really beautiful landscapes. So even those HOAs usually have some sort of landscaper that they could work with, And we do some training with them to help them, understand what our goals are and what they can be doing. But a lot of it really comes down to the client, like what do they want, and how are they directing their landscaper. Did I answer your question?
If I can use myself as an example, I'm
Sure.
on my HOA. I'm the only one thinking about this. My property management firm isn't particularly thinking about this, and they manage a lot of communities in the valley. So how can I, as an interested party, point them to better resources so that more people than me are thinking about this?
One thing you can do is take a look at your water bills and see what you're paying. Are you getting into those higher tiers? And then figuring out how to change that. A lot of HOAs, you're right, do have a lot of bluegrass. So there's lots of there's the quail training. Maybe Diane, you could talk about this just a little bit.
Can you tell our virtual friends?
Sure. The district is hosting the QUEL, which is Qualified Water Efficient Landscaping class in April. And then the town of Vail also has their sustainable landscaping workshop that they have done for many years, April 13th, I think it is this year.
Okay, Brian, here's a quick one for you. I think it's quick. Does Colorado have the ability to store all the water they are entitled to?
It might be quick, but I had to think about this. Do we store all the water we're entitled to? Yes. I guess that's kind of a loaded question if I really think about it. Water users on the west slope typically are not curtailed if they're on the main stem of the Colorado River from outside of the state. There is intrastate curtailment that happens through Water Rights Administration. So senior water rights do call out junior water rights on occasion, particularly on tributaries of the Colorado River. So that's called intrastate administration. But in terms of the Colorado River Compact, we take all of the water that we are entitled to, and we have never been subject to cutting back our water due to the compact at this time. That could change in the future.
The gentleman here.
It's not at all surprising that outdoor use is very inefficient. I'm curious, when other utilities have incentives to reduce, for example, electricity during peak times, why doesn't your organization reduce agricultural use of irrigating hayfields and such till after dark, when there would be less evaporation and more opportunity for the water to stay right at the surface for the agricultural use?
Sure. So we do have regulations on water use that are in place at all times, summer and winter, and they do prohibit irrigation during the daytime. So that's in place. And then there's, we have 3-day-a-week watering. And then I think one of the primary incentives, the way that we've really tried to incentivize people to not waste water, is through our tiered rate structure. It gets a lot more expensive the more you use.
Large hayfields and such, as opposed to just residential landscaping irrigation. You can drive around this county and see these large rotating or wheel-driven irrigation, and they're operating in 85-degree weather on a sunny day.
We don't have a ton of agriculture, I would say, in our area. And they do have their own water rights, and I think you'll find, if you head west of here into the Grand Valley, you'll find that practice just about everywhere. So I don't know if
I guess I could follow.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of agriculture statewide, as Lynn said, that agriculture typically has their own water rights. They wouldn't be part of her district, but there's no limitation on their water rights of when during the day they're allowed to irrigate. That is something that if it were as viable to change their irrigation practice, that would be up to them, and it would be sort of an educational effort to try to make those changes. There are other things that increase agricultural efficiency, lining of canals, moving to sprinklers instead of flood irrigation. These things are all up to the, water rights are private property. So those are up to the private property owners of how they want to handle their water rights. A policy agency like the CWCB can try to inform and educate or incentivize with grants and things like that. We give out grants for agricultural efficiency projects all the time. That's about as far as we can go in terms of mandating agricultural efficiency. We can incentivize.
So I'll be back to the audience after this. This is actually directly related, and you may have partially answered this question, but how can water right owners be using more water than they're entitled to? The state has water commissioners and division engineers to regulate water use. How practical is demand management?
So in our service area, when I say that subdivisions are using more water than they were entitled to, it comes from that limitation comes from one of two places. Either when they were approved as a land use, their subdivision was approved either by Eagle County or the towns, they had some limitation, and sometimes it was a square foot limitation, sometimes it was an amount of water limitation, or they dedicated a water right to the water district to serve them. They then built houses, landscaped their yards, started using their water, and are just using more. When we do the water rights accounting for that decreed area, they're using more than they should have. So part of that is the land use agencies. I'll throw them under the bus. Not really. They have an enforcement role to play here in enforcing those square foot limitations, and then we have a role to play in enforcing the water use side of it. So it's really going to take both of us to get them back into line.
Kim, I think you had a question.
As a quick follow-up to that, oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought entirely. For those subdivisions, are you guys letting the planning divisions of these communities, are you making them aware that these things are happening? So is there some level of coordination currently going on to fix this issue?
Yes, we are. And it's, as I said, this is a really big project because literally every subdivision in our county has different rules, different decrees, and we have to go through, research what the limitations are in each one, and then start to reach out with them. We are starting to do some pilot projects with some subdivisions. I would say that the Mountain Star subdivision is one we're working closely with, and they've been great. They are interested in this issue. They are working closely with us to understand what the limitations are and to figure out how to get there. So they, and I think that's kind of a pilot, and then we need to go to other subdivisions. But it's a really big project.
Okay, I have one last question, at least so far from online viewers. I'm an online user. And Brian, this is a good one for you, and understand you may not be able to answer all of this question from our previous dialogue. The 1922 agreement now seems to be an anachronism given the growth in population and agricultural use. Will the 2026 agreement recognize these changes, and what institutions or powers will drive the outcome of the 26 agreement? Also, Mexico had an important seat at the table in 1922. How did this happen? And will Mexico still have an important seat in 2026?
Holy cow, that was a lot of parts of the question. Where did it start? It started with. Will the 26 agreement recognize changes? Oh, right. Okay, so in 1922, water use was very low compared to where it is today. They anticipated growth of the upper and lower basins. That was one of the main points of the 1922 compact. So today in 2022, 100 years later, we believe that the 1922 compact is still valid in the law of the river and is flexible to accommodate the growth that's happened in the basin. They expected this to happen, and they expected actually even more to happen than has already happened. They thought growth would be actually more than what it is today. So the 1922 compact still runs the river, I would say, as the foundational principle. There's Mexico in there. Mexico had a seat at the table in 1948, 1944. 1945 was the treaty with Mexico. Are they still at the table today? Absolutely. I could add many, many more slides of laws of the river. There are what are called minutes of the treaty, the Mexican treaty, that guide use, and they are contributors to cutting back during times of shortage. So they're at the table. We negotiate with them and treat them as a partner on the river. They're a potential part of the solution, and they will be at the table in 2026. Were there any other parts of the question? That was it. Okay.
Well, I see we have a drought of questions coming online, so we have a reservoir of questions here. So up at the top, please.
Hi there. It seems like this might be a good audience just to give a little plug for the Eagle River Watershed Council's Water Law in a Nutshell program. So for anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about water law, our interim director, James Dilzell, is putting on a Water Law in a Nutshell workshop, and he can tell you a little bit more about it. I also just wanted to just alert this audience to a stream temperature alert program that the Watershed Council has been piloting throughout the last year. A lot of this is thanks to our partnership with the Eagle River Water and Sanitation District. And a lot of these programs just work to get the news out about what the water temperatures are so that the biological impact of fishing on these our sensitive habitats and the fish and the bugs can be minimized. But if it's all right, can I let James just chat about the workshop for a sec?
Yeah. No, fine. Go for it.
Awesome. Thank you all. So on March 11th, we will have Aaron Clay, who's a retired water law attorney, teach a course for anyone who's interested. Realtors and attorneys can get continuing education credits. But anyone's welcome to join. It'll be actually held here at Colorado Mountain College. And you can visit us at that table over there. We'll help you get registered for that. And another thing we'd love to mention, I heard someone talking about an HOA down there. The Watershed Council is more than happy to come and do a walkthrough with your HOA and talk through steps you might be able to take to reduce water usage outdoors. And we're working on building a program called the Clean and Flowing Rivers Program. I think Kim mentioned that at the beginning. Our lovely intern here is helping me develop that program. So we are really interested in helping our community reduce their water usage. So please use the Watershed Council as a resource. We're happy to help.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I try to be an eternal optimist. I'm wondering, it's a two-part question. Is there anything in here to be excited about? Or are there things in particular that we can be proud of, actions that are being taken here in Eagle County that we can really feel good about?
Things to be optimistic about. I think Colorado is in a really good place coming into 2026 when a major renegotiation of the operation of the river is coming forth. I think we have the right people at the helm and the right people in our state talking and working together, including the East Slope and West Slope, which often do not work well together. So I think there's a lot of optimism within Colorado that we are in a good place. And I think, you know, on the Upper Basin and the river as a whole, you know, the lines of communication are open, and there are bright minds thinking about the big problems, and it keeps them up at night. So it's depressing, but also optimistic that I think, you know, very, very smart people are thinking a lot about this.
I think that we should all be very concerned about climate change. There's a lot that we still don't know, and what we do know is scary. But I would echo what Brian said. There are a lot of smart people working on this, and I think a great example of the cooperation that can come when water, this incredibly vital resource, starts to become scarce, is right here in our valley with the Bolts Lake acquisition. The negotiations that we had to go through took 5 years to acquire that property. We had to work with a developer who is the landowner, the town of Intern, who has some water issues within their own town that they are struggling with. And the district, who was really looking at trying to find a way to create this strategic reserve that could really help us weather these dry periods and protect not just our indoor and outdoor water uses, but also our streams, our aquatic health, and the recreation and the environment that we all moved here for. And that, I just think the acquisition of that reservoir was a really major milestone in making sure that that we're in a good position when it comes to water here in the valley. And I'm very proud to have been part of people that had a lot of differences coming together to do what was right for the entire community.
Okay, we have one. Sorry. We have a few more minutes, according to this clock. Anyway, yeah, we got 5 minutes. And there's this is a good question for you, Lynn, and very timely. So, what water rights will be used to fill the new reservoir near Intern?
So the water rights that will fill the reservoir are very junior. I think the water right date on them is maybe 2007 for part of it, and then new water rights that we are filing for right now, which will have a seniority date of I can't remember if we filed right before the end of the year or right after, but they'll be either 2021 or 2022. So those are very junior water rights, but that's kind of how reservoirs work. We take junior water out of the river, we store it in a reservoir, and then we use it during a period when there are calls on the river, and otherwise we would be out of priority. That's really the advantage of a reservoir.
Okay, Kim, you want to go ahead?
I go to.
Or sorry, we got one down here. Scott. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
Will Bolts Lake be open to recreational users?
It will. Non-motorized, but that was part of our agreement with both the developer and the town of Intern, is that recreation would be available. So get your paddle boards out.
Fishing too. And fishing. Kim? I think we'll probably conclude after this.
My question is two parts, and I don't know who would be best for it, but I'm curious, is there a limit to the amount of water rights that can be handed out? Because it just seems like, you know, if you were applying for junior water rights, when does that stop? And do we have a limit on that? That's part one. Part two, when we're talking about water rights, in the 1922 negotiations, and then I'm curious what's coming, does nature, do the fish, do the wildlife get a right to any part of that water? And if they didn't, will they?
So the first part of the question was, is there a limit to the amount of water rights that the state will hand out? Depends where in the state you are. On the west slope, generally no, at this time. There is what's called over-appropriation. That means a part of a basin has exceeded its average annual supply. The Yampa River was recently deemed over-appropriated, which means that basically they need to start administering the river. Prior to that, the Yampa had so little use that you basically could take whatever you wanted because there was never shortage. That's what over-appropriation means. That does not mean that we will stop issuing water rights. There are parts of the east slope, I think parts of the Rio Grande, the Republican River Basin, and far eastern Colorado, things get a lot more complicated. But on the west slope of Colorado, we're probably nowhere near handing out water rights. However, when you file for a junior water right, as Lynn just mentioned, you assume the responsibility that it may be out of priority most of the time. It's, the more junior your water right gets, the less it may become available, and it may just become that during the peak of the hydrograph, you'll get to grab water and stick it in a reservoir, say. Part two of the question was, do fish and recreation and the environment have rights, or water rights? That's also a bit of a tricky question. The CWCB has what we call the in-stream flow program. We are the only entity in the state that's allowed to file essentially environmental water rights for protection of the environment and habitat. We are the only agency that's allowed to do that by statute. So on lots of high tributary areas on the west slope, my agency, not myself, have water rights, particularly for fish, for habitat, for in-stream flow. There's also what's called a recreational in-channel diversion water right, RICD, which exists in a few places in Colorado. I'm not really an expert on this, but I think towns, I want to say some names, but I know I'll get it wrong. There are some towns in Vail and Avon have water rights through the town to allow for kayaking, boating, things like that. And then in general, environmental law, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, mandates protection of species. It's not necessarily a water right, but there are programs that, and any big operation needs to comply with environmental law that does consider the environment. So the upcoming 2026 renegotiations of the guidelines will have to go through what's called a NEPA process, which is an environmental review, and there's time for public comment, things like that. So the environment, I guess, in some ways is considered there, but does not explicitly have a water right. I hope that answered your question.
I might just follow up real quickly on that. For Bolts Lake, that junior water right will divert during the peak runoff, and so there's a lot of water in the river at that time, and it's not over appropriated during that short period of diversion that you're filling the reservoir. And then when the stream flows are very low and you start to hit those in-stream flows that are designed to protect the aquatic environment, during those times we're actually releasing water from the reservoirs and actually kind of propping up those in-stream flows. So it's a retiming that can have some really good benefits. Thanks.
Markian. I'll let you close out, Markian, but I just want to say I learned a heck of a lot, and I really appreciate the speakers being here tonight.
There certainly are no simple answers to the questions. That's one thing I think we've all definitely learned. So with that final question, I'd like to thank Brian and Lynn again for sharing their expertise and insight with us tonight. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Don and Jennifer for their very generous support for the Climate Speaker Series. Thank you. Thanks to Colorado Mountain College for hosting us here tonight, and High Five Media for running our virtual program and audio-visual systems. I also want to thank our partners, Eagle River Water and Sanitation District, Eagle River Watershed Council. Thank you for your comments here this evening. We appreciate you being here. And certainly staff are still at the tables on your way out if you have any questions. Finally, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us tonight, both here in person and virtually. The Climate Speaker Series continues on March 23rd, when we will be joined by Susan Joy Hassel for her presentation, Code Red, Communicating the Urgency and Opportunity of Climate Action. Until then, we hope you join us in continuing to raise awareness and take action against climate change wherever you are. Thank you all, and good night.